Welcome to the vodcast for de-radicalization and rehabilitation. Today we are hosted by Pedro Liberado. So Pedro, we're very happy to have you here in this vodcast. Can I ask you to please introduce yourself and to share how you became involved in the work with de-radicalization and rehabilitation?
Yeah, sure. First of all, of course, thank you very much to Ioan and to Robert for this kind invitation. And let me congratulate the CEP, the Confederation of European Probation, and also the Council of Europe and the HELP project for this quite robust and very interesting series of podcasts in this topic, which is not only intending to grasp the current state of play and the next steps according to some experts' experiences, but in the field of rehabilitation and reintegration of VTOs, but also, at least it's my perspective, also have a clear awareness-raising component, hopefully functioning as forthcoming discussion triggers for what we will be addressing in the next years, and it will be interesting for both practitioners, researchers, policymakers, hopefully. My name is Pedro Liberado. My academic background is in sociology, even though I do not consider myself a sociologist. I consider myself a criminologist, where I took my master's, and I am also undertaking my PhD research in criminology as well. I also have a postgraduate degree in Strategic and Security Studies on the Portuguese Ministry of National Defense and Nova University of Lisbon, and even though I work in the field of criminality and criminal justice since 2012, 2013, where I already during my master's did a very thorough research in some prisons on radicalization per se. I'm involved mostly since 2018, 5 years, but these have been quite busy 5 years, as some of you know, of some initiatives that I've been involved in, and everything started with a project that gained quite a good visibility European-wise, the Art to Priest project, one of the first in the series since 2015, where we developed risk assessment instruments and a very complete training approach that was later defined last year, if I'm not mistaken, or in 2020, by RAN as a best practice, one of 14 best practices in Europe. And then other initiatives followed. Integra on probation, on providing training to probation officers and community organizations. The Way Out initiative focusing on evaluating rehabilitation programs and understanding how did they work, were they conceptualized, and many others. Over 10 European initiatives and focusing on rehabilitation. I'm currently involved in other 3, if I'm not mistaken, 3 initiatives, and there's a lot of work. Much has been done over the previous 5 to 7 years, but there's a lot of things to do in the upcoming years as well. Yeah.
Fantastic! So much experience and so many fields. But it sounds so you talked about prison probation and risk assessment tools and such. Do you want to explore just a little bit more about that field?
Yeah. So our perspective and our understanding on the risk assessment, especially in the Art to Priest, when we developed what is called the RRAP tool set, which is a broad a set of tools to be used by different actors within the prison setting, comprising one tool to be used by prison governors to assess the threats and some issues that might be happening in his or her prison that might be a trigger to radicalization or might be pose some vulnerabilities for inmates to engage in radical paths. Another for prison officers or frontline practitioners to pilot it, which is FBOG, Frontline Behavioral Observation Guidelines, to be attentive to some on daily life, on daily activities, to be attentive to behavioral changes in inmates that might be of course, an evaluation over time, what I'm talking about, that might be predisposing for someone to be to start sympathizing with a radical or extremist ideology, and then if such is assessed, then it should pass to the technical team, to the psychologists or social workers, so they can utilize a different a risk assessment per se, which in the risk assessment tool that we developed, it's the IRS, Individual Radicalization Screening, comprising over 39 indicators over 9 dimensions, plus some dimensions are also protective factors. As you know, the need to belong might be a protective factor, and also a radicalization risk factor. Even though that we developed this in between 2015 and 2018, this tool is currently being updated as part of a current European Commission initiative, the MyRad project, because these tools can't be static. Radicalization is evolving. There are new trends. A lot of research has been done, and we need to keep in touch in this regard. And in terms of rehabilitation, we are also trying to make the use of risk assessment tools more tailored to be used during the rehabilitation process, because that's something that we have also come across during the years. Also talking with people that developed and implemented rehabilitation programs with those who are incarcerated for terrorism-related offenses, is that most of the programs do not use risk assessment instruments to be during the rehabilitation phase. So the risk is not being monitored, and which of course hinders the successful rehabilitation procedure. It's also something that we are working on tailoring the risk assessment instruments to be used also during this phase. Because talking about state of the art in different countries, it's quite a challenging task, because countries tend to have different approaches. But what we try to follow is basically the latest guidelines on the Commission in the topic of rehabilitation. As you know, back in 2020. Our colleagues from Violent Extremism Network on behalf of RAN developed the RAN Rehabilitation Manual, which stipulates in a very detailed manner a seven-phase model on how and where each actor might interact. And this model goes from pre-trial detention to the last phase, stabilization. So it's quite curious to see that leaving prison is not the end. It's actually only the beginning. It's in the first phase, in the first half, if not mistaken. It's the third or fourth phase of this whole rehabilitation process, which is a dynamic process. Of course, can be back and forth. But what we are trying to understand and provide to practitioners is where and how they can intervene. Knowing, of course, that the stabilization, it's the end, and in stabilization, no more rehabilitation is needed. So the individual is having a self-sustained life, is independently and stable financially, socially, emotionally wise, has a good family and friends and peer support, so to say. So that is absolutely critical, and I think it's the state of play that should be transversally applied to its greatest extent as possible across different EU member states and third countries. Other thing that comes to my mind in the current state of the art in this field is that even though that the manual talks about de-radicalization as the ideal, the final goal, the final aim within the rehabilitation process, and I do understand why that's the approach in various German federal states. Research has shown that other countries and some researchers prefer to follow a disengagement approach, focused on not on changing the cognitive perspective of the individual, but focusing on preventing recidivism, on controlling the violent act. So the individual can keep his or her ideology, but will not commit any violent acts to disseminate, so to say, or to his or her viewpoint. Also, it's much more easier to measure this engagement. We have seen that evaluation in most of these programs doesn't occur that well, especially because it's quite difficult to measure de-radicalization, while disengagement, which is mostly based on recidivism. Of course, there are also other issues on measuring recidivism, especially over time, but it's easier to measure. And this is, for instance, the preferred option in one of the countries in France. That was the previous approach in the RIVE program that functioned by APCARS through Samantha and Darla between 2016 and 2018, and now with the PERS program implemented by Group SOS in France, also focused on disengagement. So it's a different and quite, I'll not say contradictory approach in comparison to the RAND Rehabilitation Manual, but the focus is mostly on disengagement and not on changing the cognitive perspective of inmates. And talking about the current state of the art on rehabilitation or state of play in rehabilitation programs, in different countries and regions, we did an analysis with, in this topic that back in 2020, 2021. So we understand. It helped us to understand the basic common principles of these programs that work. Those who implement and or develop the program, they said, okay, this functioned. We have seen that this function in our program. This also functioned in the different regions. It also functioned in other countries in EU. So there are common approaches between programs that function. What we have seen is that rehabilitation programs must be implemented by multidisciplinary teams, such as the approach in the Netherlands, probably the most famous one, with various criminal justice practitioners and professionals sitting periodically at the table, also with the non-governmental agencies, educational services, municipalities, trying to learn from each other the needs and the challenges and the needs that they face throughout their jobs. Also, that programs should be tailor-made to a specific inmate, to a specific probationer, should be individualized according to the specific to his or her specific needs and risks. Each person has a different background. This person has a different history, might have different risk and protective factors, and only by knowing a certain person past, you can work on their protective factors, so to decrease their vulnerability to engage in a radical or extremist ideology. Also, what we have seen is that ideally the program should be voluntarily. In some cases, rewards can be associated to the successful completion of the program. We, however, see that in some countries the participation in the program was only mandatory through the mandate of a judge, and it also had some good results. But ideally, only when an individual demonstrates his or her willingness to change, that is when there's an initial thought from the individual that he or her requires a change in his behavior, in his or her viewpoint. Of course, there are some challenges in what you perceive as voluntarily, because I recall it that one director of an exit program, doesn't matter, of course, the country and which program it was, mentioned that we are unable to know if the person really wants to change, or if he or her only wants to have some rewards, such as applying for probation in less 1 or 2 years. But then again, at least he or her committed to participate in program, and it was not mandated, so it's a starting point. And that leads us to the fourth point, which is building a professional, although gaining a professional relationship between the inmate probation and and the intervention team that is critical, gaining trust, being, as I like to call it, a professional friend. That is absolutely crucial for the correct execution of the program. And at last but not least, it's critical, and we have seen that programs that have thorough follow-up, aftercare, monitoring procedures in place tend to be more successful, especially on guaranteeing a multi-agency cooperation approach towards the effectiveness of the successful rehabilitation procedure of these radicalized offenders. Yeah.
As time is flying, I'm afraid we have to move to the last question, which is what can we expect in the next 5 to 10 years, in your opinion, in this field? What are the developments that you can anticipate somehow?
In the next 10 years, so it's quite a large time frame. There was a lot, as I started this intervention, there was a lot done in the past 5 years, but I think there's a lot more to do, especially in the context that we are currently living. And based on what I'm seeing here in some institutions that I'm involved in, others that I'm not involved, but from my awareness, we will be able to see an adaptation of risk assessment instruments, as I've started speaking, more adapted to the gender dimensions. Especially, this was very emphasized on returning women terrorist fighters from Syria and Iraq, and also emphasizing the role of ideology. So we will see some risk assessment instruments being tailor-made and even screening instruments to be attentive to some vulnerability factors related to Islamist extremism, to left-wing, to right-wing, or other different kinds of extremism, incel, others powered by disinformation, and this is critical, because we have seen that ideology did not play the role both in risk assessment instruments and also in rehabilitation procedures. Also in the research that we did, played a secondary role in most of the rehabilitation programs European-wide. Out of the 14 that we analyzed, less than half, I guess 4 or 5 that comprise a specific ideological discussion. Of course, the ideology could not be the main focus of the intervention, but can be addressed, especially usually after establishing what I've talked about the trusting case worker participant working relationship. So there's the need also, and I believe we will be assisting this in the upcoming years, additional training on the topic of ideology for frontline practitioners. The other thing is that this has been the topic in many discussions that we've been recently, and is also being addressed in various EU initiatives, which is the need to ensure that rehabilitation is a longitudinal process, longitudinally, transversally deployed over time, as longitudinal as possible. We do know how information is passing or not passing between different actors, but improving information sharing, multi-agency cooperation is critical to ensure a thorough rehabilitation process over time. And we have, of course, prisons are ideal places to start the rehabilitation procedure, but when such occurs, we see that the information is not passing towards the probation officers in some jurisdictions, or even less towards the community. And it's critical that it's not the information is not flowing between different criminal justice agencies, because, you know, in light of EU Directive 2016-680, it should pass. But I think that we'll also be looking towards not a restructure of the directive, but different protocols that need to strengthen the directive, also with the community sector engaged, because it's critical for interinstitutional collaboration models and protocols to be established. Another critical issue that I hope it will be approached during the next 10 years, and it's for frontline practitioners that are rehabilitating these offenders to be able to their best knowledge as possible to avoid deception. We have seen this in these cases in Newsman Khan in London, also with Kutim Felusai, sorry if I'm not remember their names correctly or pronouncing them, in Vienna, that were able to that were part of rehabilitation programs, and unfortunately once they left the prison and were in the community, even though followed by probation, were committed terrorist offenses. So it's critical not only, and I see here in two perspectives, for the practitioner per se to be able to have the know-how to be attentive to some non-verbal body language of the individual that could perceive, or of course failure is normal in human beings, but if we train these people on how to be attentive to these non-verbal signs, could be also relevant, and also of course when talking about also in the community perspective, as host communities play a vital role, and especially on making the necessary state surveillance, keeping offenders' commitment to disengage, and if deemed relevant, alerting authorities once we perceive some kind of deception. I recall it here three other, and very, very shortly. I know that we're probably running out of time. Not focusing, of course, on VTOs only. I say that phrase many times. Do not focus on VTOs only. Be attentive to those who are radical or are extremists. As I've said, some of them fueled by extremist trends, either insulentive acts powered by disinformation and counter rhetoric. Which are not screened assessed by services because they are not in prison for this type of crimes, but might be a greater threat, and that may pass between the lines. So it's critical to also focus rehabilitation efforts in this kind of offenders if an effective screen occurs. And the good results on restorative justice we have seen in the Basque Country, Northern Ireland, in Italy, needs to be better incorporated. I'm not talking only about victim-offender reconciliation. I'm talking about the communities, once again, to be able to accept the person who was later perceived as a terrorist, as a radical, who was effectively de-radicalized, and once they return to the community, they cannot be perceived as such. Otherwise, Chicago School of Sociology, Edwin Sandler on the theory of labeling, if I'm not mistaken on labeling theory. I'm not a criminal, but if the society perceives me as a criminal, I will behave as such. And of course, at last but not least, I am sure there are initiatives funded by the European Commission quite big in this area. Evaluation procedures needs to be incorporated. I think that we will be having, both in preventive and in countering radicalization, a lot of developments in terms of evaluation, because what we know so far is that many of the rehabilitation programs are not being successfully evaluated. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for that, Pedro. Very informative. We spanned over a range of different topics, everything from methods and approaches to programs, and especially, I think the last point we could almost pick up on in a separate episode later on, when it comes to both risk assessment, when it comes to restorative justice practices involving communities, which is a challenging task where we really need to advance practices around Europe and the world. So, well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge in this vodcast, and good luck with your future work.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pedro. Thank you
very much, Ioan. It was a pleasure.